Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we are in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. And I'm just going to start with saying that, yes, this one's going to be a long one, but this is an important one. And I hope you stick around and listen through this one all the way through. I hope I do a good job of making this understandable. Because it can be confusing, right? Even Peter talked about in some of his writings how Paul's writing could be confusing. And this is one of those sections that can be, because it's like I talked about when we first started this study of First Corinthians. It's one of those things that is a mix of the Paul responding to a letter and a question that we're not 100% sure what the question was, the use of some Greek language that can mean one or more things, right? And then the use of some metaphorical stuff that we're not 100% sure of either. And so it's just a blend of all these things that can make some of these writings, especially in this section of 11, a little bit confusing. And so there's a lot of debate amongst scholars, amongst people that read this and understand, study it, of what Paul exactly means in everything that we study here. I'm going to draw it out the best way I can, and the way I understand it from reading it and studying it. I've studied it from several different angles. I've been taught from several different angles on this one, and so I'm trying to blend this into what makes the most sense in the context of the culture, what was going on in the church, and what we see happening, and what Paul writes later on. And so we'll dive into that as we go through. But as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, go ahead and do that. That way you get these notifications daily. This is a daily Bible study. If this is your first time diving into one of these studies, I promise they're not always this long. Usually I try to keep them around 5, 10, 15 minutes at the most. But this one today will be a little bit longer. So I'm just warning you that. If you find this useful, helpful, share it, and encourage others to watch it, because we're trying to spread, and grow our ministry and what we do, and reach others. And if you have any questions, comments, disagreements, any of that stuff, we're always open to conversation in the comments. That's, as long as it's respectful, right? That's all we ask is for respectful comments, questions, disagreements. That's how we learn, right? I don't have all the answers to everything. No one has all the answers. And so this is how we learn, by continuing to grow and look at all this. So I'm going to jump into this, and we're gonna go through this. So 1 Corinthians 11 verses 2 through 16, it says, "I am so glad that you always keep me in your thoughts, and that you are following the teachings I passed on to you. But there is one thing I want you to know. The head of every man is Christ, the head of a woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. A man dishonors his head if he covers his head while praying or prophesying, but a woman dishonors her head if she prays or prophesies without a covering on her head, for this is the same as shaving her head. Yes, if she refuses to wear a head covering, she should cut off all her hair. But since it is shameful for a woman to have her hair cut or her head shaved, she should wear a covering. A man should not wear anything on his head when worshiping, for man is made in God's image and reflects God's glory, and woman reflects man's glory. For the first man didn't come from woman, but the first woman came from man. And man has not made I'm sorry, and man was not made for woman, but woman was made for man. For this reason, and because of the angels are watching, a woman should wear a covering on her head to show she is under authority. But among the Lord's people, now this is a I don't want to say it this way, but it is. This is a huge but. All right, among the Lord's people, this is huge, because he's saying things, and he's talking about traditional things. He's talking about cultural things, right? And then he kind of wraps this up and says, women are not independent of men, and men are not independent of women. For although the first woman came from man, every other man was born from a woman, and everything comes from God. So he's saying, yeah, there's these differences, but we're all the same, right? We all, we're all independent. We're all one. And so we're not independent from each other. We're dependent on each other. And so there's an understanding there. We'll dive in a little bit more into that. He says, judge for yourself. Is it right for a woman to pray to God in public without covering her head? Isn't it obvious that it is disgraceful for a man to have long hair? And isn't long hair a woman's pride and joy? for it is given to her as a covering. But if anyone wants to argue about this, I simply say that we have no other custom than this, and neither do God's other churches. And again, this points to the fact this was a custom, right? This was not a command from God or anything like that. This is dealing with a cultural and religious issue inside the Corinthian church, and something that happened and that would have been a cultural for the time, that a cultural custom for most of the area and for most of the churches in that time. And so that's something we're going to look at. But the first thing I want to do here, so we're going to go back to the beginning, right? And I'll hit this area. So the teachings I've passed on to you, verse 2, right? This generally suggests that these were the things that Paul had orally told them while he was with them in Corinth and taught them. So he's glad that they were listening to him, and so they must have mentioned some things in the letter that they were observing, and so he's grateful for that. But he's like, hey, this is the one thing, this is something I do have against you, right? He talks about a woman's use of head covering and the man's use of a head covering. And so he goes into that, right? And he argues that women publicly praying, and this is what I want you to understand. Women are publicly praying and prophesying being speaking the word of God, right? So they are praying in the public worship, and women are prophesying, or they are basically telling the word of God in a public form, in public worship. So I want you to understand that, because there's people who say that that's wrong, and we see that this was happening in the Corinthian church, and that Paul's not against that. He's against how they were presenting themselves while doing it, right? And so he says they should wear a veil as part of being modestly and appropriate in the public worship. Right? And so apparently some in Corinth were rejecting head coverings based on freedom in Christ, from what we can tell in the writings. And so some of the women thought they didn't have to. Like, we don't have to cover our heads in this, because we're free in Christ to do what we want. And so Paul writes why they should. So Paul's argument in favor of the custom is based on traditional social conventions, right? It's a society thing. It's a cultural thing. He reaches to the Genesis account of creation as an understanding of why, and we're going to see how this relates to the husband and wife thing in here, and the watchful eye of angels. And again, this is one of those areas where there's some confusion. It's like, what is Paul talking about in angels? And we'll try to answer that the best that we can. The first thing I want us to look at, though, before we get started in going through a chapter, or starting in verse 3, right? Let me pull this down real quick. Sorry. Pull myself down if I can get, there we go. All right. In the ancient Greek, the words for man and husband are the exact same Greek word, and the word for woman and wife are also the same word. And so there can be some confusion sometimes in looking at, well, okay, in the context of what the writers are writing, what Paul's writing here. Is he talking about woman or a woman? Is he talking about a wife? Is he talking about a man, or is he talking about a husband? And so it's hard sometimes, because it fits both contexts. And so this is where we have to try to figure out exactly what is Paul meaning in this. And I think as we look at this and we go through it, we'll see that what Paul's talking about here more than anything is less about men's authority over women in the church, or in anything in general, and it's more about the husband-wife relationship inside in their marriage, because that's, he talks about creation, he talks about the first man and woman and their relationship, and I think if we'll see that it's a lot of it's pointing to that more than it is just men and women in general. And now I think there is some context with men and women in general, but I think more than anything, he's reaching the context of and speaking to the context of husbands and wives. And we'll see that when we get to chapter 14, when he tells wives that they should ask their husbands questions, or question them, right? Question them. And more is the more technical term, that they should question their husbands at home and not question their husbands in the church, because it brings a shame to the husband and to their marriage and stuff like that. And so we'll look at that and dive into that as we go through this. But I wanted to put this on here so we see that and have an understanding. There's a lot of people that do not understand and do not realize that the Greek words for man and husband and woman and wife are the exact same words in the Greek. And so there can be some confusion on that sometimes. Okay, so back to 1 Corinthians 11, and we'll start with verse 3 here, right? He says, but there's one thing I want you to know: the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And so the but here, right, is a transition. He quickly moves from, kind of talking good to them, say, I'm glad about this, to, hey, there's something that you need to know here. There's something you need to fix. And so, like I already talked about with the Greek word, the Greek word gune here is the thing. It may refer to a woman or it may refer to a wife, depending on the context. I personally believe, a lot of scholars believe, that a lot of this is in the context of a husband and wife relationship. And so, the other thing we need to understand here, the Greek word that is used here for head, right? It is sometimes used in the meaning of the word source. So there's some people who wonder that it was Paul talking about the source of every man is Christ, the source of woman is man, and the head of, or the source of Christ is God. Looking at the literary, the Greek that's been written, and in this context, there's like 50 examples of this in expression, and every time it was understood that head was referring metaphorically to an authority, right? Right? It's an authority, but here's the thing we have to understand, and this is where this has been the frustrating thing for me in the church, is the church has brought in the world's definition of authority, right? And so when we read this, or when we bring it in that context, it's like, oh well, the Christ is the authority of every man, and man is over every woman, and and Christ is over, or God is over Christ, and it's like, that's not what he's meaning here. That's not what he's talking about. So what he's referring to here, what I believe he's referring to when he uses the term head in an authority standpoint, is in as with the authority of Christ over the church, right? It's not a self-centered exercise of power, right? You have to do what I say type of that. That is not what we see as an example in Christ, but it's the power, but it's leadership that takes care to serve spiritually, emotionally, and the physical needs of the wife. And so when it says that the authority, or the head of woman is man, in this sense, and then we can go back to Ephesians and look at some of these things as well, is that, what Paul's talking about here is yes, the head, the man is the head of the household, right? Or is over the household or in the marriage, but right, but it's a Christ-like authoritativeship, which would be a servant leadership. So we need to make sure we look at it and understand it this way, that when he says the man, right, is the head of woman is man, and this is why also I think that this refers to a husband-wife relationship, because nowhere in the Bible do we see that men in general are over women, right? We don't see that. The only time we see this is an authority type submission is in a marriage. And so this is why I think Paul's talking about marriage, the marriage situation, and the way things are to be inside of a marriage more than anything, is because of that, right? And nowhere in the passages do we see it's like, well, a man is able to just go around and tell women what to do in the church. We don't see that, right? And so you almost always it's talking about a marriage, husband and wife type relationship. And so that's why I think this is right. And so there's some other things too here. I got some notes. If you want if you don't get them, then I can send them. But there's also a little bit of understanding of the Trinity here as we dive into this as well. But if we go then to verse 3, right? It says, a man dishonors his head if he covers his head while praying or prophesying. And so the way I read this, right, is a man dishonors God if he covers his head while praying or prophesying. Well, what do you mean? He said head. Well, who's his head, right? So a man dishonors his head if he covers his physical head while praying. And so the way I see this, and the way I believe Paul's talking about this, is a man dishonors God if he covers his head while praying and prophesying. Well, why would a man in that time, why would it be a dishonorable to God to cover his head while praying or prophesying? Well, the reason it is because if you understand the background of the culture, Roman men, when they practiced the custom of pulling the loose folds of their toga over their head, right, as an act of piety or piety in the worship of pagan gods. And so Paul's saying, you don't bring this pagan custom into the worship of our God. right, of God. And that's you bring dishonor to God when you do that. And so he's saying don't do that. And so you bring dishonor to Christ by praying in the way in accordance to a pagan custom, right? It would be the same way as like I trying to use the example today. If there was a known thing of like the way someone worshiped the devil and or some false god in today's time, and we brought that into the church during the worship service and used that to worship God, that would bring disservice and dishonor to God for men to be doing that. And so that's what I think Paul's talking about there. Again, we know this is a cultural thing. We know that there's nothing wrong with having our heads covered when we worship God, right? The reason this was wrong was because it was a cultural thing, and in that culture it was common knowledge that if you they covered their heads a certain way to worship the false gods or demons. And so we're saying don't do that. You dishonor God when you do that. And so we need to make sure that everything we do is in honor to God when we're worship him. So verse 5 says, but a woman dishonors her head if she prays or prophesies without a covering on her head, for this is the same as shaving her head. And so I think if you read this, I think the better translation for this, and a lot of scholars do, and I think that one of the main meanings in this is, but a wife, right? A wife would dishonor her husband if she prays or prophesies without a covering on her head. And you may say, well, Chad, you're changing words. You're changing words. No, I don't think so. Right? Again, the Greek word here for woman could mean woman or wife, right? Dishonors her head. Well, we know she's not dishonoring her physical head, but who's her head? According to what Paul just taught us, the head of woman is man. All right? And so in the context of things, it would make more sense for it to mean a wife is dishonoring to her husband if she prays or prophesies without a covering on her head. For this is the same as shaving head, which would have been dishonorable. And so a married woman who uncovered her head in public would have brought shame to her to her husband, right? That is a known cultural thing there. And so that doing that as a married woman may one have suggested that she was sexually available. That was a cultural thing, right? Or may have simply been a sign of being unmarried, which would have been dishonorable as well at that time. So you're doing one of two things as a woman in that culture, as a married woman in that culture, that would have suggested things that were dishonorable. It wouldn't make any sense if he was talking so much about single women here, but it seems to be in the context of wives, that wives should not be doing these type of things in the worship service. And so again, you can disagree with me on this, but reading this and looking at it in a cultural standpoint and what Paul looks at when he's talking about the head of things, right? If we got to look at, Paul just talked about what the head of a woman is, which is man, or more than likely her husband. But a woman dishonors her husband if she prays and prophesies. A man dishonors his head, who is God, if he covers his head while praying and prophesying. And so the same thing that we're looking at. So if you look at this in this context, I believe this makes sense. So verses 7 through 9, right? Verse 6, again, if he goes to refuse, he goes in to talk about what happens if they refuse here. But it says, verse 9, a man should not wear anything on his head when worshiping, for a man is made in God's image and reflects God's glory, and woman reflects man's glory. Again, I think, again, if you look at this in the context of how we look at the way that God has set up the relationship, especially with marriage, right? And you have the Godhead, right? You have the man, and then you have the woman. Now, again, I've seen it as this stepping thing of, well, this person's over this person and this person's over, and I think it's more of a representation of each person that we're looking at here. It's verse 7 through 9. Woman is the glory of man's. Is probably the use glory here is in the sense of one who shows excellence of, right? The way that this Greek word is meaning here in the term glory that's used, it's one who shows excellence of. So if we look at this, right, a worship for a man is made in God's image and reflects God's glory. And so it's a man, the man here that's worshiping, or the husband that's worshiping, reflects the glory, or what shows the excellence of God, right? And so the woman who is worshiping reflects the glory or the excellence of her husband in this sense. And so, then he uses the creation. For the first man didn't come from woman, but the first woman came from man. Again, using this line of succession of the source of things, but also, how things laid out from the creation story is how he's going. And so, the one thing we see is Paul argues that a woman, by the excellence of her being, also shows how excellent man is, since she has taken out of the man at the beginning. And again, I link this more to a husband-wife relationship because, again, in the beginning, that was a husband-wife relationship, and we know that the woman was created as a helper. For man at the beginning of it. You can see that in Genesis 2, verses 20 through 40. Now, again, some people have taken that term helper out of context in the sense that, oh, well, women were made to basically serve man. That's not that is not the case here. Because if you look at that Hebrew word for helper, and I don't have the time to go into that, and I apologize, but if you look at that Hebrew word for helper in the Hebrew, that same term is used to describe God helping man. And so we can't put that in an authority type of thing, because if you do that, then that means that men would have authority over God as well. And so we want to understand that basically when we say that the woman is a helper for man, or under the man's authority, or those type of things, it's a mutual respectful relationship. It is not, I'm a man over this woman, right? It is, I like the idea that it is, I am the type of man or the type of husband that a woman would want to place her authority-ship, her personal-ship, her safety under, right? Her leadership under. That's the idea there. And that's not the idea of, I just go around telling you what you can and can't do. That is not what we talk about. That's not biblical. That's not Christ-like. And any church, anyone who teaches that is wrong for teaching that. And so we need to understand that. And so, right, like I talked about, right, Paul, again, does not deny that women was also made in God's image. There are some people who try to use these verses to say, oh, well, man was made in God's image, but women were made in man's image, and so men are better than the women. That's not the case, right? All mankind, including men and women, were made in the image of God. And so don't use this to try to take that out of context. And so we see Genesis 1:27 affirms that. So those are things that we do there. And again, like I've talked about, I think, and Paul probably has continued to think primarily of a husband and wife relationship here, since the first man and woman were also the first married couple. So it makes sense to reference that in the sense of a marriage, right? And so we see Paul's appeal to the order of creation shows that his words are not merely directed to the cultural situation of the day as well. It's about, you know, the principle here of the male headship in marriage that continues through all generations. And so again, and what I've talked about with headship applies. It's not authoritative, it's not a dictatorship, it's a servant leader. It is, if you are a leader, if you are the head of your family, your marriage, you do that in a servant leadership way. And that is the example that we have from Christ. And so anything different is unbiblical. And that if you see that, that needs to be addressed. So though we see the cultural issues surfacing here, there's cultural issues here. Most of it is about, being respectful and showing mutual admiration and lack of not disrespecting each other in the marriage. And so that's why the women should wear head covering. And that's why that really doesn't apply to us today, because that we don't live in a culture. Now, if we lived in a culture where those things applied, then that's something that we would need to do. And the closest thing I think I can get to it here would be like wedding rings or something like that. If a wife got up and took off her wedding rings when she got to speak or pray, that would be a little iffy. It was like, why is she doing that? Because she's like, by taking those symbols off, it's like, hey, I'm showing that I'm available, but you're not available. We know you're married, and so that would be dishonorable to the husband that we see there. And so to continue this in verse 10, I'm sorry, verse 10 is here. For this reason, and because the angels are watching, a woman should wear a covering of her head to show she is under authority. Again, this makes sense in the marriage situation, under authority, right? Well, whose authority? The authority of a marriage, the authority of a husband, all right? That basically saying she needs to keep her head covered to show, one, because angels are watching, and two, so that she shows that she is married. right? And it brings respect to the marriage. And so it says a wife, the term here, the Greek term, and the way this literally would play out is a wife ought to have authority over her head, where the word authority refers to a head covering, which was a symbol of authority, basically meaning, right? You have this, it's the symbol of authority, the symbol of a marriage is over her head. And so basically what it says, the wife should wear a head covering over her head as a sign that she is under her husband's authority. That's kind of what he's saying there, as the sign that she's married, that she's under husband's authority. Others have suggested that the head covering is a sign that the woman's authority, that the head covering is a sign that the woman has authority to prophesy in the church or to participate generally in the church assembly. I don't see that in there anywhere. I don't see that in the translation. Others don't see that in the translation, but it has been suggested, and I want to throw that out there as an option. Now, because of the angels, there's a lot of confusion around this. Some don't know. Some just we don't know what he means here. Others think that more than likely he's talking about the fact that angels are watching when we're worshiping, right? And Paul does go about this. The New Testament also talks about the facts that angels are watching as one motive for obeying commands. We see it in 1 Timothy 5, Hebrews 13, and 1 Peter 1, right? And so since we see those things, that a lot of scholars believe, okay, he put that in there as the idea of like, hey, this is motivation for continuing to obey God's commands because the angels are watching you. And so we need to do that. And so that's kind of the idea and the look at this there. So we're 3/4 of the way through this. I hope you're not too confused. If you are, I'm sorry. If you have questions, ask them, please. That way I can help try to clear anything up. I've tried to make it as clear as possible, but I know this is a hard study and it's something that's a little deep. So 11 through 16. Let's finish this up. But, he says, or nevertheless, and this is a transition, right? Anytime he says this, nevertheless, he's taking what he's already said, and then he's making another point out of it that's different, right, than what he's already said. And he says, nevertheless, but among the Lord's people, and he's pointing out women are not independent of men, and men are not independent of women, right? And for although the first woman came from man, and every other woman was born from a woman, every other man was born from a woman, and everything comes from God. And he's saying, look, we're all one. I mean, this is what he's saying here, right? He does not want us he doesn't want to be misrepresented here as to diminish the importance of women. I truly believe that's the point he is making here. It's like, hey, understand, just because we have some of these societal rules and these cultural things that we have here, women are not independent of men, right? And men are not independent of women. He's like, okay, I've been making this point about the first woman coming from man, but just because the first woman came from man doesn't mean that every other man had to have come from a woman, right? From that point on. And so he's saying, look, we're one. We're to work together. It's not I'm over you or I'm not going to listen to you. It's no, we work together. And so we need to make sure we understand that. Do that. Women or men are both God's creation, and all are mutually independent at a basic level. And so we need to do that. And believers recognize that God made men and women mutually dependent on one another. We see that, right? We need each other. And so then he says everything comes from God. Both men and women must ultimately submit to God, the head of all, right? And so he clears that up. Then he finishes up with 13. And so judge for your, is it right for a woman to pray to God in public without covering her head? The answer to this is no, right? It's not. In this time, in this culture, it's not. And especially, I think the saying right here is more of, is it right for a wife to pray in God's public without covering her head? And I think that's the more obvious example that we're in. Isn't it obvious that it's disgraceful for a man to have long hair? And isn't long hair a woman's pride and joy, for it has been given to her as a covering? But if anyone wants to argue about this, I simply say that we have no other custom than this, then neither do all of God's churches. And so, again, Paul uses a cultural thing, and he says, yes, that women's long hair covering their shows that God intends for women to have that type of covering. Like women's long hair is intended, that's what God intended, so let's keep it that way. And the same thing with men. Men shouldn't have that long hair. Men should keep their hair cut. And so he basically says then if anyone wants to argue about this, because some of the people in church, the Corinth church, didn't agree with Paul. His final answer is that the use of head covering was established custom of the church. Basically, this is a cultural thing. This is what we do, and so continue to do it. Right? Is what he's saying. And so this almost all interpreters, most scholars believe that this what he's talking about here was a custom that was culturally based. And because it's culturally based, it is not something that we need to abide by today. Now, what we do need to abide by today is there a mutual respect for each other, right? The respect that men should have for women, right, and women should have for men, and also, especially, which I think Paul's talking about more than anything in here, is the relationship inside of marriage and the respect and mutual admiration that husbands and wives should have for each other inside of this, and that the men should take the authoritative role in the marriage, right? And the woman shouldn't do anything to that's disruptive or that would hurt, be what we would, I've lost the word that I'm trying to use here, but basically bring shame on the husband, right? Both ways, right? And we're going to look at that, and there's a reason I'm mentioning this, because we're going to hit on it a little bit once we get to the end of chapter 14 of First Corinthians, with which talking about being disrespectful, women being disrespectful to their husbands inside the worship service. And so I think this is what this is getting at more than anything. One, this is culturally appropriate, and two, right, doing these things brings shame to the marriage, brings shame to your husband, brings shame to yourself, and brings shame to God, because we in the culture that are in it means different things, right? And so it's the same thing for us today. In the culture that we live in, right, we shouldn't be doing anything, especially as married people, inside the worship service that would bring shames upon our husbands or upon our wives or upon God. And so we need to understand the culture that we're in and make sure we behave accordingly. What this doesn't mean is that women aren't allowed to do anything in the worship service. We specifically see that the women were praying in the worship service and prophesying in the worship service. And so and if we, like we've talked about before, to understand the word prophesying, it literally means basically to speak the word of God. So they were teaching and speaking what was said to them, or what God had given them, right? The word that God had given them, they were speaking it in a public forum to men and women alike. And so that's what we have to understand in the reading of the context of this, of what this means. Now, I hope that this has made sense. Again, if it hasn't, please ask questions. If you disagree, that's fine. Again, we can disagree, we can have discussion, but it has to be respectful. If you just go in there and you're insulting or anything like that, then we're going to delete the comments and we won't have the discussion, because that's not Christ-like, and that's not what we're called to do. But I hope this makes sense, and I hope that the context of this helps you dive a little bit deeper into what was Paul really talking about here when he's talking about the creation order, the men and women, the things that they were doing in the worship service, and those type of things. So again, I appreciate everyone. I know this one's long. We're at 32 minutes on this one, but I really appreciate all those who stuck to the end. If you have any questions, ask them, put them in the comments. You can send them to me directly, however you want to do that. But more than anything, I really appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these.